to ESG Today. I'm your host, James Conan. Today we're going to talk through a range of topics. Our guest is an expert on investor relations with a background in that space and communications. So typical challenging topics of conversation, especially if you're a larger business. And ESG has just become incredibly relevant to that job and that responsibility, especially with a lot more vocal shareholders, I would say, a lot more technology that's scrutinizing anything that your organization might be saying publicly. It's a bit of a minefield. So today we've got Mario to join us, and we'll just run through a little bit of his background and find out a little bit more around what's happening in the market. Mario, are you there?
I am indeed. Thank you, James, and thanks for having me on today. I'll give you a bit of my background, just so you know where I'm coming from and how my experience applies to this field. Currently a managing director of a firm called Retorix, and we work in investor relations and media management and broadly the influencing space. It can be significantly broader than that. We're largely working in that startup to mid-tier space, but also have listed clients. My own background is mainly in listed companies, managing investor relations, regulation, and communications broadly. Did that for about 17 years of my life. And I've also had experience in working for peak business bodies and in my misspent youth in political advisory. And when you bring that all together, it's really about getting the right message to the right people at the right time. And that's probably what we do.
That sounds like a fascinating background and experience, moving especially from political advisory into large business. And how do you take that and apply that to the smaller market, the smaller mid-tier market, all that experience?
Well, it's a rich field. There's a lot happening, even despite this year where it's been much harder to get funding and to get recognition at the smaller end. There's just a lot happening, a lot of good ideas out there that just need some money to get them going. And it's usually founders who are very good at one or two things, that smart people with good ideas, often able to get to a certain point, but then they realise that they need expertise in other areas. And what we do is really help them think like grown-ups in a sense. There's a lot more disclosure and structure and strategy required as you try to progress up the levels of company size and complexity. And our role is really, on one hand, to help them put those structures in place. And if we don't have that expertise, and like everyone else, we're good at a few things and terrible at a whole bunch of things, then we just help them bring those resources together. But also it's about getting them recognition and a profile. We spend a lot of time talking to journalists, to investors, to just people in the sector and the field that might be relevant to our clients. And the idea is that we really just help them establish a presence and really build for the future, which is where ESG comes in. In my view, ESG is really about long-term risk management. It's not that hard to make money today, but if you want to be making money in 5, 10, 20 years' time, then you have to have a fairly considered and structured approach and an agile approach that changes over time.
And is that something, that kind of criteria when you're dealing with investors or current shareholders of these organisations, is ESG a topic of conversation that they often want to drive or they bring to the table, or is it now founders and executives of these businesses really driving that conversation first? Who's kind of leading the chat?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a mix. I'll go back a bit first. But I first started noticing investor mindsets changing about 10 years ago, sitting in a lot of investor meetings in Australia and overseas, where questions around ESG framed in that context, rather than just risk management, started to emerge. And it wasn't too long before you turn up to an investor conference or doing the rounds with post results, meeting large investors where an ESG in-house specialist would actually start attending the meetings. That was new 10 years ago. 5 years ago, it became quite common. And the questions really are around not just the environmental aspects, because the issues will vary for each company. For some companies, the social issues will be more significant, the environmental and governance, particularly at the small end, comes under the spotlight because it's often lacking there. So I think what you find is that investors increasingly, although not uniformly, are really appreciating the value of ESG frameworks in terms of long-term risk management. I think the data show that returns are at least as good for those companies who are measuring these things and disclosing them. Because it's absolutely no good to measure them and to structure your business if you're not telling investors. You may as well not be doing it. You won't be recognised for it. So I think it's still a bit of a mix. Unfortunately, there's still some feedback that a lot of companies still don't really understand how ESG can apply to their business. I think it's changing slowly, and I think that a lot of hard lessons will be learnt before we really get a majority of companies using these tools and these methods properly.
Certainly in our experience with listed businesses and the challenges that they have, a lot of questions being thrown at them, and as you kind of talked about, that ramp up over the last 5 years, and some of the challenges are around the different rating houses, people like Sustainalytics or MSCI, that everybody's got a list of questions and a list of criteria, and there might be correlation, there might not be. It's not particularly universal, and it's almost like if you're a listed business and you don't answer the questions, are you going to be penalised? It seems like there's a reputational risk there to carry forward, even just responding to those questionnaires from external people that aren't involved in the day-to-day of the business. Do you have any kind of insights or how do you manage that kind of approach? Is it come to me through this time period and leave me alone, let me do my business outside of that, or do you have a kind of an open door policy?
Well, look, it's hard, and every company is at a different stage, different levels of resourcing, different levels of sophistication. Look, unfortunately, you will be punished for how you disclose it and how you manage your risks, but I think it's important to really be proactive and say, and just be honest, look, we can't answer every questionnaire. And I know what that's like working in-house, where you're bombarded with different questionnaires, and it could easily take up all of your time. And then it becomes a risk-benefit analysis on where your time is better spent. I think most investors still want to know that you're focusing primarily on the business and not on filling in questionnaires. But I think it's useful to actually see where the wind's blowing and at least pick a structure, pick a firm, and spend some devoted time with one of those systems. For example, the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures is the main one certainly in terms of environment. That's as you'd expect. That's one, if your business is an emitter, and most businesses are to some extent, you really can't ignore that. So if you pick that one and polite apologies to the rest, then I think your investors would broadly understand. But it really is something that you should be resourcing as best you can, and increasingly if you can. As I said, ESG is different for each company, so you need to be very systematic and clear about which of the levers are most relevant, affect your long-term value, and focus on those. And there's no harm in ignoring the rest if you could demonstrate that they're really not relevant to your business. Investors aren't generally that pedantic. They want to see a balanced and considered, intelligent approach to how you handle disclosures. But the bottom line is you can't ignore it. And the number of companies, particularly at the smaller end, and again, I say this with some empathy, but a lot of them are still releasing compliance documents as far as for annual reports and nothing more. That's really not good enough. And the market will punish you either actively if you've already gained their attention, or more likely simply by ignoring you. You just won't get on the radar.
And I think what's interesting as well, there's this wave of kind of scrutinizing statements out there. Greenwashing, is kind of a big phrase that's being thrown around a lot. And I know obviously there's been just in the domestic market in Australia, one recent court case is there kind of, in terms of communication strategies and how do you go to market, don't rush to these statements, don't rush to say net zero by whatever, by 2030, that strategy work, it sounds like it's possibly, there was this mad rush to get statements out early, and then all of these businesses being caught up in this. In terms of the strategy work that you do with your clients, is that, do you kind of advise them around slow down, let's build out a longer term strategy and a longer term goals, so that when we are making these, be it a net zero strategy or a net zero announcement, we're prepared, we're not, under pressure or rushed?
Absolutely. And look, that's what investors want. They want to see that you're thinking through the issues, that you're being measured, that you're not being reactive. And look, working a lot as I do in the emerging companies, mid-tier space, it's a constant struggle. I always feel like I'm trying to slow down, the horse pulling on the reins. I often describe myself as a handbrake to happiness, because a lot of these companies want to grow, and putting yourself in the best possible light and being salesy is very much part of that. But it really is a red flag to investors when you want to present as having all the answers and having them now. They don't expect that, and they know that if you claim that, then you're lying. So don't do that, is my advice. It's okay to take the time, think through the issues, present something that is considered, but at the same time, not always be going to the stock standard promises that you see in ASX release after ASX release, or annual report after annual report. The flowery statements around commitments and valuing staff, or putting the environment first. Look, it may be true for your company. If it is, by all means, say so. But don't claim that. Often you look at an annual report, it's like you could have done a word search, just change the company, and the statements are pretty much the same. I think investors are increasingly sophisticated, and not just sophisticated investors, but the general public really don't have much patience for spinning out of any kind of situation. And I think there are good examples of where it's done well, not necessarily in the investment space, but if you look at people like Shane Fitzsimmons with the Royal Fire Service, he was a guy of his time who really spoke factually, honestly, didn't gild the lily, and only spoke about what he knew. And that's really what investors want. Back in the day, you really couldn't leave a board meeting or exec meeting or a meeting with investors without somebody saying the phrase, under promise, and over deliver. It seems to be something that people have forgotten. It's always better. From a listed company's perspective, for example, what you want is for your shares to be fully valued, not undervalued, not overvalued. You really should be always telling your story, but not selling the story. It's not about spin. It's not about marketing. It's about managing information in a way that is transparent, also commercial, that inspires confidence over the long term.
A lot of conversations we have are around that supply chain risk and seeing the supply chain as an extension of your business. And have you seen that kind of the strategy work being done with your clients around mitigation of risk, or looking at scope 3 emissions? How do you actually start that conversation with your suppliers, or build a strategy to address that? Because it's a tricky one. You want to get data from them that potentially could be quite, asking suppliers who their suppliers are could be quite confronting, and obviously an uncomfortable conversation. That communications piece, do you have any recommendations for our audience or businesses globally, how they might start this conversation? Because it seems like it's something that isn't going to go away.
Yeah, and I guess it really starts with I guess the regulatory structures we already have in place. And we're talking about directors on company boards, especially listed company boards. They're required to know what's going on in the business. It's illegal to not know. It's not okay to be ignorant about something. You need to be asking the right questions. You need to be demanding answers from management. And if you're not getting them, in a way that's satisfactory, you need to persist. And that's the law. Your directors need to know what's going on in their businesses. At the same time, management needs to be held accountable. And I'll answer your question a bit more directly, but I think it's important to go through first. Investors really expect that ESG measures will be built in to reward structures. And as I said, there has to be a penalty for failure. There has to be a very clear expectation. And in the end, what really motivates senior executives is meeting their KPIs and getting paid. That's the place to do it. And there's a whole lot of measures that companies need to incorporate. And there's data available, whether you're looking at the reputational cost on cost of capital, insurance costs. Insurers are very good at, very smart people, probably working in dark rooms with computers and spreadsheets and multiple monitors. They're very good at pricing risk and penalising those who don't mitigate risks. That can be measured. The cost of employee recruitment and retention, that can be measured. And in a society where increasingly people want to work for companies that align to their values, that's an important thing. Now, in terms of, I guess, answer your question a bit more specifically, I think the discussion around supply chains should start from a position of recognising that your neck is on the line if you don't understand. And this is where strategy comes in, because it's very difficult often to move away from established supply chain structure, and there will be costs involved with that. It's something you need to be considering several years out. Today, I think it's important to actually get the right resources, because a simple discussion with supplier is not something you can rely on. Even if we don't assume bad intent, it's very hard to get the data that you want. But as you said, there are incentives for obfuscation. So there are a lot of there's a lot of data out there. What you need is a system or a platform or an advisor who can actually triangulate data from different sources and overlay that. Look, there's a lot of good work being done by not-for-profits. I myself, I'm a board member of a not-for-profit called International Justice Mission, which is all about slavery. It's the biggest anti-slavery organisation in the world. And they harvest data from all parts of the world where slavery is known to exist. They're also friendly governments, public data that's published. There's also data that potentially could be obtained at a government-to-government level. It's a question of really working a number of different avenues. Some of these might require investment in time. They won't necessarily happen today or tomorrow. But it's about getting the data from a number of different sources and amalgamating that. No one company can do that. That's why it's important to get the right advisor or the right system that will help you do it. But at the same time, there are increasing penalties for A, not knowing, and B, not acting on supply chain issues, whether it's slavery in supply chain, which investors are increasingly concerned about, or it's issues around environmental sustainability. And we're seeing that with, I guess, the conundrum that we face with the renewable energy sector. Most of us are very supportive of renewable energy for good reason. And investors have been a massive driving force in making that happen and continuing to make that happen. But we all know the problems with, for example, solar panels and the places they're produced, around how workers are treated, and at the other end, how these things are disposed of, creating significant environmental issues. There's a lot to balance. No one's saying it's easy, but investors do expect that companies will be making concerted efforts to understand these risks along the supply chain and ESG broadly, and in taking concrete measures to address them.
I think it's a big challenge in terms of jurisdictional and legislation across different jurisdictions. When you talk about solar panels, and the US passed legislation, I think it was in June this year, around the border force enacting, nothing from certain provinces within China are going to be allowed in the country. And so I guess it's quite a difficult conversation to have with a supplier that might be in a different market, and these people down the chain that don't have an obligation from a regulatory or reporting perspective to have to do it, yet their suppliers or their clients or customers upstream are requiring it. So it is a difficult challenge to make sure that you can, as you kind of alluded to, the strategy around start the conversation as soon as possible to get the ball rolling, because it is costly and it is expensive. And I think this whole supply chain disruption piece that we've had throughout the war in Russia has really proven that supply chain disruptions can be very expensive and can be unforeseen, and that there's a whole challenge there in terms of having real transparency around, or even alternative options within that supply chain.
Absolutely, and I think companies should really be nurturing alternative supply chains all the time. I mean, if you're a portfolio manager in the funds management industry, then sometimes there'll be a big opportunity cost from holding cash. You still hold a balanced portfolio. You need to mitigate that risk through diversification, and that does mean not squeezing the lemon absolutely dry on every occasion. It means thinking about the future and how someone might move your cheese.
It's quite the challenge. Do you have any, considering our audience here is a global audience, any kind of recommendations around how to manage or how to go about maybe it's a raising capital piece or conversations with potential investors in this current climate? Because it seems like quite a difficult to ask.
Well, it's always difficult, and especially difficult now. Look, I think I keep going back to simply being deliberate and honest, not over-promising, not being aspirational in your statements, just being very clear about what you're good at, what you're doing, what the challenges are. I think it's important to get good advice, and companies aren't alone here. They don't have to do it all on their own. There's plenty of data available, plenty of case studies to look at, other companies doing it well. But you're quite right, every jurisdiction will be different. But it's important to actually be efficient and enhance that information, and just pick one or two things that you're going to do well, rather than trying to do a dozen things that will end up badly. So that's the best advice I can give, that you won't have the best setup overnight, particularly if you're a small company. You need to simply choose what you're going to do and do it well.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you very much for your time today, Mario. I really appreciate you dialing in. I think our audience will certainly learn a lot out of today's episode, and appreciate the extensive experience you've had over the years, government, large business, now working with small businesses and medium-sized businesses. It's a very valuable insight that you're providing.
Thanks, James. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much.
So that's our episode today. I think it's very fascinating to see what type of KPIs can be pulled and levers. Mario was talking about executive remuneration potentially as a KPI that could be pulled, and transparency from the investor side in terms of what are they expecting? Are the institutional shareholders putting pressure on large listed businesses? And all of this kind of has a big filter down into that supply chain and potentially emerging markets or organizations within that business's realm or sphere of influence. And then how do you build a strategy that might impact them or get them better prepared for emerging changes? So Mario talked a lot about strategy work. It's definitely a hard thing for a business to kind of deal with, because it's a cost to the organization to put time aside, resources aside to build out that strategy. But the challenge is, if you're not doing it, how prepared are you going to be in the future? Are you going to be ready for that next market? Are you going to be ready for that investor communication or conversation? Or what about the regulators? How are you going to manage all of those risks? So it's definitely worth spending some time on your communication strategy, looking at different components around in terms of how can you engage with investors, or even from a debt side, potentially your bank or your partners, because they're all going to be asking more and more questions around KPIs. They're going to ask you to be a lot more transparent and intentional and deliberate around what you're trying to achieve. And as Mario suggested, fantastic advice, pick one or two things and really focus down on that. It could be something to do over the next year. So drive out a program and a strategy, focus down on getting two to three things right. And then out of that, we can start looking at different ways to engage with your stakeholders, your internal and external. So I hope you found that insightful. It was definitely a very interesting conversation, and make sure to dial in next week with ESG Today. Thank you.